The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. It has not changed since 2009. At 40 hours a week, that produces $15,080 per year before taxes. The MIT Living Wage Calculator puts the actual cost of survival for a single adult nationally at $25.02 per hour, or $52,041 per year. That is a $36,961 annual gap between what the law requires employers to pay and what it actually costs one person to cover rent, food, transportation, and healthcare, with nothing left over. In the most expensive states, that gap exceeds $50,000. In the cheapest states, it is still $27,000. No state in the country has set a minimum wage at or above its living wage threshold. This video runs the numbers by state so you can see exactly where your state stands and what the gap means in real dollars. The federal minimum of $7.25 was set in July 2009. In inflation-adjusted terms, the minimum wage peaked in 1968 at the equivalent of approximately $13.05 in 2024 dollars. Since then, without a legislative increase, real purchasing power has eroded by roughly 44%. Source: Economic Policy Institute, epi.org's publication/minimum wage tracker. As of 2024, 30 states and Washington, D.C. have set their own minimum wages above the federal floor. The states still at $7.25, Georgia, Wyoming, Texas, Tennessee among them, are generally lower cost of living markets, but even there, the minimum wage covers less than 30 cents on every dollar of living costs for a single adult. Washington State has the highest minimum in the country at $16.28 per hour. California is at $16 statewide. Massachusetts is at $15. At the other end, workers in Georgia and Wyoming are still earning $7.25 once, 124% less than a full-time worker in Washington State for identical hours. That difference on a 40-hour week is $18,726 per year. Source: National Conference of State Legislatures, ncsl.org/labor-employment-minimum wage-chart. But here is the critical point. Even the highest state minimums do not close the living wage gap. Washington State at $16.28 is still $9 MIT living wage of $26.18. Massachusetts at $15 is $12.74 is below its living wage of $27.74. The gap exists in every state, regardless of how aggressively that state has raised its floor. Most people assume the minimum wage debate is about whether the floor is high enough. The more accurate framing is this: the minimum wage was never designed to be a living wage. It was designed as a floor against exploitation, not a target income for sustaining adult life. The MIT Living Wage Calculator exists specifically because no government standard accounts for what it actually costs to live in a given geography. Once you understand that distinction, the numbers stop being surprising and start being structural. The MIT Living Wage Calculator produces figures for every county in the United States based on local costs of housing, food, transportation, childcare, and healthcare. Source: livingwage.mit.edu. Here are the real numbers for the states that tell the story most clearly. Texas sits at the federal minimum of $7.25. The MIT living wage for a single adult in Texas is $24.72 per hour. The annual gap for a full-time Texas minimum wage worker is $36,374. Texas is regularly cited as a low cost of living state. A minimum wage worker there still earns less than 30 cents on every dollar of what survival costs. Mississippi has the lowest living wage requirement in the country at $20.31 per hour for a single adult, reflecting its lower housing and cost profile. It also sits at $7.25. The gap is $13.06 per hour, or $27,164 per year. Mississippi is the most affordable state in America, and a minimum wage worker there still faces a $27,000 annual shortfall. California at $16 statewide faces a living wage of $27.32 per hour. The gap is $11.32 per hour, or $23,545 per year. San Francisco has a local minimum of $18.67 and a living wage significantly above the state figure. So the gap narrows but does not close even in the city with one of the highest local minimums in the country. Massachusetts at $15 faces a living wage of $27.74. The gap is $12.74 per hour, or $26,499 per year. One of the most progressive minimum wage states in the country, and still $26,000 short of what a single adult needs to cover basic expenses. Hawaii, at $14, faces a living wage in Honolulu that is among the highest in the country due to extreme housing cost. Average annual housing for a single adult in Hawaii, per the MIT model, is $22,692, or $1,891 per month. The gap in high-cost Hawaiian markets exceeds $12 per hour, or $24,960 per year. Washington State at $16.28 faces a living wage of $26.18. Gap, $9.92 per hour, or $20,592 per year. Washington is the closest any state gets to its living wage threshold, and it is still $20,000 short. Here is the number that reframes the entire policy conversation. If the federal minimum wage had kept pace with productivity growth since 1968, it would be approximately $24 per hour today. That figure comes from the Economic Policy Institute's analysis of 5 decades of wage productivity divergence. The MIT living wage that represents the floor for basic survival is almost exactly what minimum wage workers would already be earning if wages had tracked the productivity of the economy they work in. The gap between $7.25 and $25.02 was not created by workers demanding too much. It was created by 50 years of productivity gains going somewhere other than wages. Source, epi.org, publication/minimum wage tracker. A $36,961 annual gap is not abstract. Here is what it looks like against specific expenses. Housing. The standard guideline is that housing should consume no more than 30% of gross income. At $15,080 per year, the federal minimum wage annual income, 30%, is $4,524 per year, or $377 per month. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition found that there is not a single state where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a one-bedroom apartment at fair market rent within the 30% threshold. The average fair market rent for a one-bedroom nationally in 2024 is $1,124 per month. For a minimum wage worker, that one bedroom consumes 89.5% of their entire pre-tax annual income. Source, nlihc.org/ORE. Food. The USDA moderate cost food plan for a single adult is $406 per month, or $4,872 per year. On $15,080 gross income, food alone consumes 32.3% of total earnings, leaving nothing for rent, transportation, or healthcare simultaneously. Source, fns.usda.gov/NPP USDA-food, plans cost food reports, monthly reports. Transportation. The AAA estimates average vehicle ownership costs at $12,182 per year, including financing, insurance, fuel, and maintenance. For minimum wage workers outside major cities, the majority of minimum wage workers in America, a car is non-optional. $12,182 in transportation against $15,080 in gross income leaves $2,898 for all remaining expenses combined. Source, MAAA.com/auto repairs. Annual cost of ownership. The arithmetic does not require a budget. It requires a calculator. Housing, food, and transportation alone at national average costs total $30,150 per year. The federal minimum wage produces $15,080. The gap between those two numbers, $15,070, is what minimum wage workers cover through shared housing, skipped meals, deferred health care, and debt. The Congressional Budget Office analyzed the Raise the Wage Act, a proposal to lift the federal minimum to $15 by 2025. The findings: 900,000 workers lifted out of poverty, wages raised for 17 million workers, and approximately 1.4 million jobs eliminated as employers adjust. But here is what that analysis also showed. $15 per hour still leaves a national living wage gap of $10.02 per hour, or $20,841 per year. The most politically contested wage increase in recent U.S. history would still leave the average minimum wage worker $20,000 short of what it costs to live. Source: cbo.gov, publication/56975. The policy gap does not pause while legislation moves. 3 levers produce measurable change at the individual level. Geographic arbitrage is the most immediate. A worker earning $18 per hour in San Francisco is roughly $9 below the local living wage. The same worker earning $18 per hour in Memphis, Tennessee, clears the MIT living wage for that area, which is approximately $17.50 for a single adult. The income is identical. The financial outcome is categorically different. Moving from a high cost of living state to a lower one does not change what you earn, it changes what your earnings can cover. Skill development compounds faster than legislation. The median wage for workers who complete a community college certificate program in fields like HVAC, medical billing, electrical, or information technology is approximately $41,000 per year, according to the National Center for Education Statistics. Source: nces.ed.gov. That is still below the national living wage of $52,041, but it is $26,000 more than federal minimum wage. Most certificate programs take 1 to 2 years and cost $5,000 to $15,000, an investment that typically pays back within the first year at the higher wage. Multiple income streams close the monthly gap while skills develop. An additional $500 per month in side income after taxes produces roughly $296 in net cash, or $3,552 per year, against a $36,961 living wage gap that is a small bridge but not a solution. The compounding effect of geographic relocation plus skill development plus supplemental income over 3 to 5 years can meaningfully close the individual gap, even as the structural one persists. The number to carry from this, $36,961. That is the national annual gap between what the federal minimum wage pays and what the MIT Living Wage Calculator says a single adult needs to cover basic expenses in 2024. In high-cost states, the gap exceeds $50,000. In the cheapest state in the country, it is still $27,000. No state has closed it. The minimum wage has not moved in 16 years. The living wage moves every year with prices. The gap grows every year that the floor stays flat. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of where these numbers actually stand, subscribe. Every week, I run one comparison like this on real financial data. Next up, what a $50,000 income actually buys in the 10 most and least expensive cities in America after taxes and cost of living.